Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the United Nations Environment Programme, I would like to extend a warm welcome to you to this 9th COP of the Convention on Biological Diversity, being hosted by the Federal Republic of Germany in the city of Bonn. This Conference of the Parties comes at a time when biodiversity is regaining its central place on the international environmental agenda. More importantly, not just the environmental agenda, but indeed the agenda of sustainable resource management, of the relationship to our response to climate change, its links to the agricultural sector, agricultural biodiversity, and indeed food security on our planet. It is also a COP that is occurring at a time when many have asked the question of how the international environmental governance arrangements around biodiversity. Let us remember here that there are also a series of other multilateral environmental agreements that touch on the use and conservation of biodiversity. That as we try and look at how this system of international cooperation and governance is able to deliver the kinds of objectives and targets that the international community set for itself in 1992. If we look at the reports such as the Global Environment Outlook report that UNEP released last year, but many other assessments and reports on the state of the environment and indeed on the state of biodiversity on our planet, then clearly our instruments have not been sufficiently effective. The willingness of states and of citizens across the globe to address the loss of biodiversity has not resulted in the kinds of actions that will allow us to, in a couple of years' time, say to the world the 2010 target agreed in Johannesburg has been achieved. On the contrary, we are facing in some respects an escalating crisis of biodiversity loss. We have not managed to gain the confidence of our citizens, the interest of our economic actors, and ultimately of our economic development policies to achieve the objective of sustaining the diversity of life on our planet, which is so critical to maintaining the goods and services, the functionality of the ecosystems which underpin virtually all of our economic activity and indeed human well-being. At this COP in Bonn, I hope that member states will take a renewed initiative at giving direction and in some respects a new lease of life to the Convention on Biological Diversity, but more importantly to the actions that it decides and therefore puts the onus and responsibility on actors across the world to implement. Climate change and the resilience of our ecosystems has opened a new potential link that should allow us to demonstrate more clearly how critical biodiversity and ecosystems are to our ability to cope with climate change. The recent food price crisis and the questions associated with our future agricultural production systems, our ability to feed 7, 8, 9 billion people in a way that does not simply escalate the mining elements of the agricultural systems we have today, open up new opportunities for trying to address the linkage between managing farming sectors, managing land, sustaining biodiversity, and yet optimizing production systems. In the context of the Conference of the Parties, it is essential that as we address key issues in their detail, we do not lose the perspective of the connections and the links to other elements. I alluded earlier on to the fact that we have many different multilateral environmental agreements. It is one of the phenomena today that decisions taken by member states under the auspices of one MEA may very well find themselves being contradicted by decisions of the same member states in another Conference of the Parties. By doing so, we are not only confusing the international system, we are also leaving our citizens wondering where precisely the directions are that governments wish to set. The Convention on Biological Diversity, with its 3 pillars of conservation, sustainable use, and access and benefit sharing, do require new directions and new impulses. Conservation and protected areas have sometimes in recent years been viewed as a kind of defensive approach to biodiversity conservation. I hope in Bonn we will embrace the successes of protected area systems, also the renewed need to invest not only in the maintenance of the existing ones, but also the further development of protected area systems, not least in the marine realm, where we are far behind of where we should be today. Sustainable use remains an issue that, particularly for developing nations, is critical to allow citizens who are confronted by poverty and livelihood challenges to be able to use biodiversity in the way that we have often done successfully, but increasingly in a world of global trade and subsidies and perverse incentives have taken us across the threshold of sustainability. Perhaps most importantly in Bonn, the third pillar needs renewed vigor. It has not been addressed adequately. Since 1992, the world has been struggling with trying to address how an access and benefit regime could actually allow us to provide for the interests of all nations that wish to engage in an international effort on the conservation of biodiversity. Access and benefit sharing is one of the pillars that will allow us to leverage greater economic resources, incentives and opportunities. And it is essential that an access and benefit sharing regime does not remain a theory, but is indeed taken forward as a practical set of steps that will allow us, hopefully by 2010, to reach a point where an access and benefit sharing regime will become a reality. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this COP is indeed a critical moment in the history of international efforts of biodiversity conservation. It is my hope, as I'm sure it is of everyone who will be in Bonn, that the decisions and the signals that come out of this COP will confirm that the world has begun to pay more attention again to biodiversity conservation, not as the preoccupation of the few, but as a responsibility for all of us to ensure that we can sustain life on this planet. Thank you.